Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Kurt Nielsen. Welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
Hey, Richard. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Kurt is calling in from Yorba Linda, California via the phone. So we hope that you can hear Kurt okay, because he has a really important story. Just by way of introduction, Kurt turns 59 about when this podcast is released. So you're going to hear this on once Kurt is 59. He turns 59 on July 1st of 2019. So Kurt and I are the same age. Kurt is married. He has 3 children. He's active LDS, and he is gay. And as I've thought about this interview that we're about to do to Kurt, all day long I've been thinking about the courage it takes for Kurt to do what he's doing. And I've thought about the younger people that come out, and that takes a lot of courage too. So I don't want to minimize that, but being, Kurt's age and being in a marriage this long and being closeted, I think you get so used to being closeted that this takes tremendous courage. And Kurt is not out to too many people, but we've been messaging for a while, and Kurt just felt it was time to share his story. And he offered a wonderful prayer before we started and just prayed that God would loosen his tongue. And that's my prayer today, is that I will do a good job of bringing Kurt's story out, and that you, our listeners, will be touched by Kurt and his good heart and the things he's about to share, and so that we can all understand better and how to minister. And before we get started, I thought I would I haven't done this before, but I appreciate you that are going to Apple or iTunes and reviewing the podcast, leaving a comment. I think that helps more people engage. And I just like this comment from Todd Squad. Richard Osler has an amazing way of drawing people out to share their vulnerabilities. He's able to ask tough questions without offending, and then able to take the answers and add some insight. His questions provoke thought and consideration to so much more than the topic. If I could give it 10 stars, I would. I'm a better person to listening to the Todd podcast. It has taught me the true meaning of love. And that's really a credit to all of my guests, especially my LGBTQ friends that are willing to come on and share their stories. So thank you. And others of you that would like to share a thought about the podcast, we appreciate it. But now let's turn to Kurt, K-U-R-T Nielsen, Nielsen. And once again, welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
That's a good Danish spelling.
Tell us where that spelling's from again.
Denmark. Yeah, that's where Nielsen comes from.
So tell us, Kurt, why you want to tell your story.
Well, first of all, I'm going to give a shout out to Yorba Linda. Our claim to fame is we have a presidential library in Yorba Linda, the Richard M. Nixon. And it's a beautiful community, and I've been able to raise all my kids here, and I'm so grateful for the ward and the area that I've been here for about 20, I think we've been in Yorba Linda about 23 years. Why do I want to share my story? Well, I think about sort of the theme. We all have stories like from A to Z. So I don't know, maybe this is the case story of my life, but I've really sought inspiration from God on what he would have me share. And I've been thinking about sort of the theme of what we'll be talking about. And for me, probably the major theme is that of God's relentless pursuit of me. Even when I've seen myself from an early age as someone who was unlovable, unworthy, undesirable, vile in some ways, and so broken that my only choice was to hide in probably every possible way. I heard someone once say that God likes to come through in the end, which I personally don't like that aspect of God, but I found it to be true. And I know that God has been so patient with me through so many years of my life and has directed me. And those are some of the things that I want to share. And I've also, hopefully this thing will come out, that I really believe that there is a law of compensation from God that is enforced for his gay children, because I think he really knows what a challenge being gay, especially LDS or any Christian gay, that it is really a challenging experience, especially for us that are older, where there was absolutely no space for us to understand this as we've grown up. And so if I come back to why I want to share the story, it's very God-driven. And last year, about a year ago, I went to this wonderful conference back in St. Louis. It's called the Revoice Conference. And it was created, that was the first year they did it. And it was 500 gay Christians who had not felt like they'd had a voice. That's the title, Revoice. And coming together and just speaking and sharing their love of Christ and their love of God. And so many of them had just by the nature of them coming to their leaders and saying, I'm gay, what do I do with that? So many were turned out from their churches. And yet they looked beyond that and they still love God. And it was so moving to me. And so when I'm at that conference, I had this impression that I needed to be more open. And as I pondered that, I also had this impression that God would direct me how and when this was to happen, and that I could just put him in the driver's seat. And so, fast forward about a year, you were interviewing, I think it was episode 125, this wonderful young man named Eric. And I was listening to his podcast, and the Spirit came to me and said, this is where I want you to share your story. And so I'm going to lean into that. And it was interesting that just a few days after I listened to that podcast and had that impression, I was attending a family home evening that's been created by an adjoining stake where I live for LGBTQ plus members. And there I met Eric, who doesn't even live in this area.
That's
and
cool.
It was sort of a sign to me that God was calling me to do this.
Yeah, I'm deeply touched by your introduction, Kurt, and just your good heart, and I hope our listeners can feel that. I've been playing with the knobs on my soundboard, which is something I shouldn't be doing because I don't, but I've tried to turn up your volume, so I think people can hear you pretty well, but there may be some background noise. But I thank you for that wonderful introduction and meeting Eric and just following your God-given impressions to share your story. Tell a little bit about when you first knew you were gay.
That is sort of a complex story. Just to give you a little background on my family. So I did mention I was Danish. My extended family on both sides were some of the first converts in the church in Denmark, Wales, Ireland, England, and Sweden. And even to this day, my extended family on both sides are pretty active, faithful members of the church. And I had this great privilege. I didn't think it at the time, but I was raised on a dairy farm in a small town, actually in northern Utah, up in Cache Valley, and have two older brothers, a twin brother. Now, the interesting thing about me being a twin is that my parents didn't know they were going to have a second baby. And the doctors just kept saying, oh, you're just going to have this big baby. And so anyway, I came 2 minutes on the heels of my older twin brother. And they had to go out and buy.
That's crazy.
They had to go out and, what's that?
That's crazy.
So they had to go out and buy another crib. And and then I have a younger sister. So my mom had 5 kids in 5 years. And so we just sort of grew up in this little block. But from if I look back and sort of this hindsight, I can see at a really early age, my interests were completely different from my dad and my brothers and the men that were around me. I loved reading. I loved decorating. I loved gardening. I loved art. I loved to talk. I loved writing poetry. I loved clothes. And what was really shown to me as masculinity around me was, hey, sports, hunting, and I really did not relate to that. And I was looking in a photo album recently, and maybe this was very telling, once I look back in time at this, and I'm probably like 3 or 4, and so I'm sitting on this couch, and so my little sister was probably 2, and then I'm in the middle, and then my twin brother is sitting on the other side. And so here's my twin brother. He's got an army helmet on with camouflage, and here I am sitting with a wig holding my teddy bear, which has a dress on it. And so it was pretty obvious something definitely was going on with this little kid. And I was really challenged by that. I remember at being 5 or 6 and starting school and standing at the edge of the playground, and my feet on the asphalt, my toes just barely touching the grass, and I'm watching the little boys my age out playing and kicking the ball, and it was like, I just don't get it. I don't understand that world. I don't even know how to engage that. But then I remember looking at the girls behind me playing whatever they were doing, and like, well, I'm not that either. And I remember just being very confused about where I fit in the world at a really young age. But I had a great mom, and I think she, knowing that, just sort of stepped in, and we loved hanging out. We loved a lot of the same things. She'd even let me play hooky once in a while from schools, just so we could be together. And I had so much admiration for my mom. She loved developing new talent. She loved being with her family, especially her sisters. And she had this reverence for her mom and dad and her siblings and her ancestors. It was so impressive to me. Her concept of family was that within it we find love and safety. And I think that, of more than anything else, her honoring her family caused me from an early age to want a family of my own. And so from an early age, I didn't have a recognition I was gay, and that could have simply been that there wasn't language for what I was experiencing. And again, this wasn't all surprising coming from the culture I grew up in. It's just, basically 100% LDS little community. And I remember my dad, who was actually in the Navy in the Korean War, and who grew up in the same small town that I was raised in, telling me once that he didn't even know that being gay was a thing until he was in the Navy and was guarding a sailor that had been convicted of the gay act. And I can look back in hindsight and say, what was going on? I can recognize that probably my first crush with a boy was in 7th grade. And I don't remember anybody's name, but it's interesting to this day, all these years later, I still remember that young boy's name. And I dated a lot. That's just what we did. I had girlfriends. But as I looked back again, I mean, those that I dated, there was really nothing physical about it. And I think that because I was LDS, my lack of physical interest in my girlfriends was just translated by me and my girlfriends that I was just super righteous. And I think as a gay LDS, we can sort of hide behind that. You're just doing the things you're supposed to be doing. I would say that my biggest fear growing up, that I didn't fit the mold of what was mirrored for me in masculinity, and I had a real fear around being exposed. And I was very conscious, always thinking about, well, how am I walking? How am I talking? How am I sitting? And there was this huge fear that I would be exposed as not being a man. And that was actually pretty terrifying for me. And I, again, not knowing really how to relate to sort of the peers in my age, I really didn't have a lot of friends. But I remember when I was a teenager, God brought me a best friend. And I think it was a very miraculous timing for me. And we shared a lot of the same interests. And he and his family were a huge blessing for me, because it was probably the first time I realized, hey, there's other people outside of my own little family unit that can love me. And it also came at a point when I was pretty lonely. And it's interesting that years later, this friend would come out gay to me.
Wow.
And to this day, I still consider him one of my saviors. And it's an ongoing theme in my life, is that God seems to bring gay men into my life at many crucial junctions. And I think that says something about us as gay men, and that we have a sensitivity. We have, I think, a desire to feel and understand the Spirit and God. And it makes sense to me that when I really needed to be saved, that it was always God moving through a gay man, bringing a gay friend into my life that would step up where nobody else was. And so that's been sort of an ongoing theme in my life.
Just thanks for sharing some of this. It's just so helpful. And I think there's no shame that you still remember the name of this young man in the 7th grade. Your first crush, so to speak, because that's just the reality of your situation. And it would be logical. I remember my first crush. Her name's Jane. She's since passed away, but in the 8th grade, I remember, so I just think that's fine to remember things like that. And it's just the reality of your situation. And I think there's no shame in that. And I love the way you just talk about that. And I love the way you talk about not feeling masculine enough, and maybe that, and everybody needs to fit in to their, and so that's a tough road. And I love the way that God brought this other teenager into your life. Were you suicidal during this time, Kurt?
I was not.
Okay.
I think I just was doing life. I think it was very structured around me about, just being part of a family, working hard on a farm, going to school. I think my mother's relationship with me gave me a place to sort of explore some of my interests. And I think because I was so close in age to my brothers, who were, very typically masculine and into sports, but I think even though I wasn't, I think that sort of threw sort of an umbrella of protection over me, because nobody was going to mess, with me because of my brother. So interestingly, I was never teased. I was never, teased growing up.
Did you feel you were gay at this point, or just didn't have language, or was it more just you felt I wasn't masculine enough?
It was all around masculinity. I never had it cross my mind like, oh, I'm gay. And because there was no language given to me to even formulate that. So it was more around a fear of like, I need to be more like the men around me, and not understanding, well, I'm not like the men around me, and this is the reason, and maybe that can be a good thing.
And that can be a good thing. That's cool for our listeners. Talk about, did you serve a mission? And
I did, and that's just what we did in our family. So I followed my 2 older brothers who also served missions, and I was called to, at that time, it was called the Scotland-Glasgow Mission, which took in the west coast of Scotland and Northern Ireland. And it was a tough, beautiful experience for me, and I learned a lot about myself and God, so I wouldn't trade it for anything. And it was also foundational for me. It was on my mission that I saw it and received a testimony of the Book of Mormon. And I can only describe it, Richard, as it was like Pentecostal in nature. It was so profound. And it's interesting. I just thought, well, I guess that's the testimony in this way that everybody receives. But as I've talked to more people in my family, it seems like this is more of an outlier type of experience. And it seems like most people, it's more of a line upon line, and they just know. And I also had this wonderful experience in the MTC where I was walking with a group of missionaries, and we were going to go to the Provo Temple. It was early in the morning, and I had this just experience of profound joy. And I don't think even in the rest of my life up to this point, I haven't felt that to that degree again. And I had the impression that this was the type of experience that God lives in, this type of joy and this Godhead family. And there was such a desire for me to live in such a way that I could have that. And I remember as we walked toward the temple that my clarity of the Spirit became so in tune that I could even discern the water drops in the fountain of the temple just rejoicing and laughing as they were meeting the measure of their creation and their joy of being God's creation as water droplets in that fountain. And that was really profound to me. It was this idea that God is profound and there is more to him than just what I had probably experienced up to that point of just doing the normal weekly going to church. There was something deep and glorious about this Heavenly Father that I had not experienced up to that point. And I've thought about that, like, oh, did that make me anything special? It really doesn't. I think what God needed for me to know, because he knew what I would be experiencing as a gay man in such an unenlightened time, basically, of the church history, that I needed something so profound that would cement me to the church and keep me active in it. And there was a few times that I wish I hadn't had that experience. But I
That's
had,
honest.
But I had, and it's something that I cannot deny, and it still anchors me to this day, even when I struggle and maybe feel isolated and disconnected at church at times, is I cannot deny that foundational experience I had that God is power and he is engaged in my life. And as I share more of my story, hopefully that'll come out.
I love the water drops. There's something that's really cool. I've never, I'll look at fountains differently because of you, Kurt, and God's beautiful creations, wherever they are. And that is part of his beautiful creation. And I sometimes think, as I served on the Isle of Man as part of the Manchester mission about the same time, and on the northern part of the Isle of Man, we could look into southwest Scotland, and on the east side of the Isle of Man, the west side, we could look into Northern Ireland. So maybe I saw you from a distance while you were serving. We had a lot more. We were not at war in the Isle of Man like you were in Northern Ireland during that time.
Oh, my God. Yeah, I mean, it was the height of the IRA when I was in Belfast, and we would hear bombs go off at night in the city. And instead of fire damage cells, you'd walk by a shop and it'd be a bomb damage cell.
Wow. What a unique time to be in Northern Ireland. Thank you for your missionary service and a wonderful part of the world that we both love. Talk about any experiences from your mission you'd like to share.
Yeah, there was one that was I want to share, that was really profound for me. I had moved from Belfast to another hot spot, which is called Londonderry. And I had a brand new missionary, and we were out tracting one night. And I look at the end, we're sort of on this small street, and on each end there was lined up probably about 15 young gang members on each end of the street and looking at us. And I just sort of took my companion and we walked up to one end, and I just started talking to him for a little bit. And it was just, I thought it was, in hell. I mean, it was such darkness. And I knew they were there for us, and they had their eyes on us. And so I said, hey, we got to go. And so we started walking, and now both sides of the gang joined together and started following us. And it was a pretty deserted area, really with nobody around. And all of a sudden they're behind us, and they start, throwing like rocks and bottles that are hitting us. And eventually we stop, and then they circle around us. And there's, and then it's like the circle just sort of closing in on us. And I remember praying, because I had this, and I remembered this so distinctly when I was set apart for my mission, that I would be physically protected. And I called on that. And I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I knew God had given me that promise. And just as I said that prayer, this car out of the middle of nowhere, the streets have been deserted, just comes by, pulls up a little bit ahead of us where this was happening, and just stops. And I look over there, and there's just two men sitting in the front of this car, and they're just looking ahead. And when this car stopped, this gang pulled back from us. And so I took my companion, and we walked over there, and I just said, can we get a ride out of here? And they said, yes. Just get in the back seat of the car. And we're pulling away, and this gang just becomes enraged, and they are pelting this car with bottles and rocks and just bricks. They're bouncing off this car. Must have just trashed it. And the interesting thing for me to this day is these two men didn't even comment on what was going on. They just looked ahead, and all they said is, where can we drop you off? And so that's my little story of, I believe, being saved by angels.
I believe it too, Kurt. That's a pretty touching story. Talk about coming home from your mission, and what was life like for you when you returned?
Well, I came home, and I went to a year of college before my mission, and the idea at that time was I wanted to be a doctor, so I was studying pre-med, and so I came back and sort of continued that. But I was home about a year, and my mother, who had not really had any health problems, all of a sudden couldn't breathe one day, and we took her to the hospital and found out that she was just full of cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer. And I was so quick, like within several weeks, she passed away. So from having my mom, who was, at the time, really was the only person I thought really loved me. And, excuse me, and to have her taken so quickly. And it was interesting, Richard, that when she was sick, I remember praying and I had the Spirit just say, well, everything will be okay. And I took that as, oh, she'll be okay. But then she passed away, and that's really taken me decades to pretty much understand what God was trying to tell me there. And in a lot of ways, it has been okay. I was bearing my testimony a few weeks ago in sacrament meeting, and I was thinking about that impression that I had, and the Spirit just basically clarified that even more and said, haven't I brought wonderful women into your life to compensate for your mom's death? I brought you a wonderful wife. I brought you a wonderful daughter, and now I have a wonderful daughter-in-law who so many ways have filled that void. And it's taken me really decades to understand what that impression was. But from her death is the first time you had asked before if I, as a teenager, had become depressed. I hadn't, but I certainly did after my mom's death, and I didn't really know how to deal with it. My father said everybody was in such grief that there was really no capacity for anybody to sort of look at what was going on with me at the time, and I just was collapsing emotionally. And did become suicidal, and that's the first time I'd ever came into such a dark space. And I have a lot of compassion now. When I hear somebody who says that they're suicidal, I know what that feels like. I know how hopeless and dark that can feel. And then God again is going to reach down and save me, and in the only way he could. And in college, I had met a friend and made a friend, and he had invited me to say, hey, come over. And I was living at home going to school. And he said, hey, there's an opening in our apartment, come over. And I did, and that was good for me in some ways, but I was still extremely depressed. I was sleeping a lot, and he became really concerned for me. And he just came to me one time and just said, hey, I'm seeing a therapist, and I made an appointment for you. And here it is. Here's the address. Here's the date. And I want you to go. And I went, and it was so miraculously healing for me just to speak for the first time to someone that I had issues. And I was able to regain some hope and felt the depression subside. And it was in that therapist's office. It was the first time I really uttered the words that I'm gay. And so I was 22. And I remember recently reading a study that just came out that it's around 13, 14 when somebody who's gay first recognizes that they're gay, but it's not until they're around 21, 22 that they admit that to anybody. And it makes me think, because I lived it, and I would always ask the question, well, what do you think is going on in those 7 years in that young man or young woman's life? And there's a lot of issues going on. And this friend, like my friend when I was a teenager, he later shares with me that he is gay.
Wow.
And so that was the second time God used one of his gay sons to literally save me.
Yeah, keep telling. I think we're all on the edge of our seats, Kurt, and just as you're sharing your journey, and I just love your story because it's different than a lot of our stories that are younger men and women. And I think you bring us to an era where there was just less talking about it. And so this is helpful. So go ahead and keep sharing your story.
Well, even though in that therapist's office I said, hey, I'm gay, but I probably didn't use that term because we weren't allowed to use that term back then. It was probably I'm same-sex attracted or something. But I pretty quickly shelved that idea that I was gay because I still, again, this is in the early 80s, and I still didn't have the context to know what to do with that knowledge. And just to put it in context, it was only a little over 10 years prior to that the term homosexuality first showed up in one of our handbooks of instruction. So I was aware of President Kimball's teaching that it could be overcome with effort. That's really pretty much all I knew, that if I lived the gospel and I put enough effort into it, that I wouldn't need to worry about it, that it would just take care of itself. And I also knew, and it had this impression for a lot of years and a desire to have a family. And so I would date, and people around me, of course, were getting married. And I remember having the thought wow, why is that so easy for them? And it just seems so complex for me. But I kept going back. I had this line in my patriarchal blessing that kept coming back to me that said, the time will come when you will go to the house of the Lord and there be sealed for time and all eternity to a true and loving companion. So I had that in the back of my mind, but I'm like getting, 22, 23, 24, 25. And I remember in my mid-20s thinking about that and the Spirit coming to me and just saying, and interpreting that and saying, well, Kurt, what this means is that it will be a period of time before you get married. And so that gave me some patience to just sort of continue on and sort of trust in God. So I continued school and I finished my pre-med degree, but then I had this just very perplexing impression that I wasn't meant to pursue being a doctor. It seems like God, so much in my life just tells me something, and then I'm just sort of like, well, what does that mean? And then I have to sort of figure that out, and He sort of guides me. And but that was one of those experiences. Like, okay, well, what do I do now? But I'm willing to move forward and say, okay, well, maybe I'll figure something else out. I was willing to trust in that. And so I was really confused. And I had this dream one night when I was pondering about what I needed to do. And in the dream, I am told that you need to go back to school and become a landscape architect.
Wow.
Now,
that's very different than what you're doing.
Was I had never heard of that before. What is that? I mean, it wasn't like something that's even in my wheelhouse, like, oh, I know what a landscape architect is.
Wow.
And so I did some research and discovered, oh, there actually was something called a landscape architect. And I found out there were only 2 schools in the West that offered that as a degree. And one of them just happened to be the university I was attending. And because of that dream, I'm going to do that. It took me 3 more years to get a degree in landscape architecture, but I graduated at the top of my class. And I actually applied and was accepted to an Ivy League school in a graduate program for landscape architecture. And then God, as He seems to have done so many times in my life, He steps in and says, I don't want you to pursue graduate work. And so, okay, what do I do? So I thought, okay, well, I have this degree. So I moved to Salt Lake and began to work for a small landscape architectural firm. But it was interesting at that time, so I was maybe 27, 28, the Spirit came back and I had this impression that the period of time that He had foretold that I would get married, that I was in that, and that was going to happen shortly. And so I did meet, and I became engaged to a young woman from my singles ward in Salt Lake. But as I thought about it and I reflected on it, I knew that I loved the idea of getting married more than I loved her. And so as difficult as that decision was, I broke that engagement off. And it was really a tough time for me because I thought, well, am I missing out on this opportunity that God has promised me? And so at that point, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I've been in Utah for coming up on 3 decades. I just wanted to change. And so I'm like, I just want to go anywhere else to just try something new. And so I sent my resume out all over the country, and I was applying for positions wherever I could find them. And it was during that time that I had another dream. And in this dream, I was shown a city I had visited as a teenager, Irvine, California, and was told that this is where I needed to work. And as hard as I looked for a firm in Irvine, I couldn't find one. And the closest one I could find was there was a job opening in Newport Beach in a landscape architecture firm. And so I'd also applied to a firm up in San Francisco, and I was contacted by that firm and the firm in Newport Beach for an interview. And that one of the firms was in San Francisco. To this day, probably isn't lost on me. But when I called the firm in Newport Beach to go over the details, they informed me that they had just, like the week before, relocated to Irvine. And so I interviewed with both firms and was offered jobs by both. And the San Francisco firm would have been my dream job, but because of the dream and the direction I'd had in that, I accepted the job in Irvine.
Wow. And I lived in Irvine for a little bit, so I'm kind of following you around the world here between Scotland and Irvine. And tell us about meeting your wife in this area.
So it's probably the first week, so I move and start my job, and the first week I'm attending the singles ward, which is at the time the happening ward at Irvine. And it's just jam-packed from front to back. And I was sitting closer to the front, and there was only a few, maybe 5 or 6 seats next to me that were open. And right before the meeting started, this young lady comes in with sort of her entourage, and she said, "Hey, can you move over?" And so I did, and she sat by me, and I was just immediately drawn to her in a way I'd never been drawn to any other woman that I'd ever dated. She was funny. We were cracking up. we were flirting, and I'm not a big flirty person. It's like, I didn't even know how to do that. But with her, it's like, wow, I'm pretty good at that. And so she mentioned that she had just finished being a Relief Society president in her singles ward, and she was just ward hopping. And I thought, oh my gosh, I might not ever see her again. And so the only time I've ever done it, I asked for her telephone number, and she gave that to me. And so our first date happened to be on St. Patrick's Day, and we're talking about our lives, and I told her I was like 28, 29, I can't remember at the time. And she is like, "No, you're not. She thought I was like 21. And so I actually get carded on my first date with her. She made me prove it by pulling out my driver's license. And she was older. So my wife is about 3.5 years older than me. And she'd had a really full life up to that point. She's traveled the world. She was working. She had bought her first home and, dated and just was just enjoying life. And, what was interesting is that just before we met, she had a powerful spiritual experience that the home that she just bought, that she would meet and fall in love with the man she was going to marry. So that was just maybe a month or two before we met. And so we dated. It was interesting for me. It's like I'm with this woman that I am attracted to on every level. And we got engaged, and we ended up getting married in the LA Temple like 8 months later after we met. And, as some Mormons do, we had our first baby 9 months later, and which is my daughter, Samantha. And then we had 2 sons following over the next several years, Jacob and Matthew. And as I reflect on all this maneuvering, like don't go to medical school, don't do your graduate work in landscape architecture on the East Coast, it's pretty clear to me that all that maneuvering that God had been doing in my life really had nothing to do with my career, but had everything to do with me meeting Mary.
I'm just so touched with the story to this point, Kurt, just acting on impressions. And I think of Elder Uchtdorf's talk where we have all this impressionistic painting. But it's often not till older in our lives or till things kind of into clarity that we understand the hand of the Lord in our lives, and we're acting on impressions. And often he doesn't just give us full light and understanding, and it's later when we look back. And so I love the way, he got you to Irvine to meet Mary, and that was all part of the plan. And then you had these wonderful 3 children. Do you consider yourself bisexual, Kurt?
I've been asked that a lot because I am married to a woman, and the answer is no. My orientation is toward men. That's where I'm attracted. But the best way I could probably describe it, Richard, is that I have an orientation to one very specific woman. And the other people that I know that are on mixed orientation marriages, I think they would all describe it that way. That there is just one very specific woman that they can have an orientation toward. It's also very interesting to me, and it seems to be the case in most gay men's life in mixed orientation marriage, is that our physical attractions seem to come via being emotionally attracted first to our wives, which seems to be sort of just opposite, I would say, for most straight men, that they seem to have the physical attraction hit them first, and then hopefully it sort of settles into also an emotional attraction. I am grateful for Mary, that's my wife, in so many ways. She has such a deep commitment to her faith, and she performs anything she's asked with perfection, be it a seminary teacher, or she just finished being a Relief Society president in our ward. And she just amazes me that she is one who fulfills her calling and seeks God's impressions of what she needs to do, and she does magnify it. And she's also, which I need because I'm a little more in my life, a little more stoic. She is funny. She brings that part out of me. She's also the smartest woman I've ever met. And if I have to look back, again, looking back at my blessing in my patriarchal blessing that talks about the traits that my companion would have, which is true and loving, I would say that Mary, I've learned, and it's taken me, we're coming up on 29 years of marriage, is that she completely fulfills that she has been true and loving, and I deeply love her.
This is a beautiful love story, and I love doing podcasts of mixed orientation marriages at work, because I think we see some that kind of blow up, and then at least I thought that just never could work. And the church, we both know the church doesn't prescribe this, but I think through personal revelation, members are finding themselves into mixed orientation marriages that work. And I love that you're sharing your story. I know many people in my circle that are in mixed orientation marriages, and I think your story helps them to see a path and see what you're doing and your wife's doing to make this marriage work. Did you tell Mary you were gay before you got married?
I didn't share with Mary that I was gay before we were married. And it's interesting because I don't sit back and go, did I make some deliberate choice to be deceptive to her? I just think I shelved it so deeply, and I felt, basically because this is sort of what I was taught, that God had brought me into that marriage. That was very clear to me, and that he would take care of it. And I guess in many ways he has taken care of it, probably just not in the way I might have expected at the time. But I found through the years of marriage that my attractions didn't go away, but continued to be as persistent as ever. And it did cause me a lot of shame. What am I doing wrong? I'm trying to do everything that I felt I was meant to do. I'm raising my kids. I'm supporting my family. I'm accepting church callings. I'm being active. But this aspect of me which I believed. I mean, because that's what I had been sort of led to believe, that by doing these things, that the end result would be that this would go away. And so, I'm sort of doing life and not thinking about it too hardly. But I got to the age of 44, and it was really an interesting experience that I had, because first of all, I had the impression that I was literally in the exact middle year of my life. So I guess if I live past 88, people will know this wasn't exactly right. But so I'm at 44, and I'm having this impression, and then the Spirit, as I'm pondering this, like, why am I being given this understanding about being 44? And the Spirit comes to me, and I had this distinct question, and the Spirit asked me if I wanted to carry the baggage I had for the first 44 years of my life into the remaining 44 years of my life. And I at the time thought, the baggage the Spirit was referring to was my being gay. But I would later find out that God had a lot bigger plans for me around healing and becoming more whole and self-actualized. And so, that's, again, looking in hindsight and knowing that. So I just thought, well, what do I do with this? So I started therapy, which was really a tough thing for me. And I remember it took me like 2 or 3 times to tell the therapist, hey, I'm gay. I probably whispered it because I still had so much shame around it. This therapist I was led to, I felt really directed to go to him. And thank goodness God led me to a therapist that showed me what I needed to focus on, the really deep wounds I had around my masculinity, and a lot of the deep shame I carried with me throughout my life, especially not feeling man enough. And it was through therapy that I finally had the courage or the words to share with Mary that I was gay. And I still believed at this time that this was something that I could change if I put the effort into it. And there was a lot of stories out there of people supposedly, hey, I was able to change. And I said, hey, I can do that. And so over the next few years, I began to read all the books I could find on the topic. And I attended men's retreats for gay men and just sort of put my efforts in those ways.
It's interesting for me, and it's so courageous of you just to share your story, but you come out in different periods of time where then you're adopting sort of the philosophies of the culture and religious organizations. And so at 44, you come out to a therapist, but then you're put into this world that you can change this even, and it's just interesting for me. I really, I think one of the focuses of this podcast is to take shame away around from sexual orientation, because you know this, because you've walked this road, just how much shame you held for something I think that nobody should feel shame for. This is how I just really feel strongly that everybody's created straight or LGBTQ as God wanted them to be created. And even straight people have ranges of masculinity. And so I just think that as we're maturing as a society and we're seeing everybody equal, and people are listening to your podcast, I just hope that you can use Kurt as an example and look at yourself and not feel shame for who you are and the way God's created you. And some of us need to go to therapists to do that, and some of us can do that on our own, and some of us can do that through having Christ in our life. And I think you've done all those, but I think going to a therapist is not a sign of weakness. I think it's a sign of great strength on your part, Kurt, and great courage. Did you ever talk to a priesthood leader and come out to a priesthood leader?
Yeah, it was during this time after starting therapy that I knew I was living a good life. It's not like I needed to go to a bishop and confess, any deep, dark sins that I had. But just by the nature of being gay, I felt that I was sinning. And just as you had mentioned, there was so much shame that was around that. for me. Just to have that orientation was like, there's something sort of vile about me. But I got the courage and I made an appointment with my bishop at the time. And I go into his office and I sit down and he goes, "Okay, Kurt, what can I do for you?" And I remember I just started sobbing. It's like uncontrollably sobbing. And that was just somewhat surprising to me. But I think there was just so much shame held into me. And it was interesting for me because the bishop interjects and says, "Do you remember when last year we were at a ward party in the park and we just talked for a few minutes?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember that." And he said, "There was no reason for me to think this, and I had not thought this in all the years that we have known each other, but I had the impression that you were gay." And he said that after that, he was really perplexed on what to do with that information. And his first thought was, well, I need to call Kurt in. I need to talk to him. And he said that the Spirit, in no uncertain terms, said, "No, Kurt will come in when he's ready." And then he acknowledges it to this day through some of his own misunderstanding and ignorance. His next thought was, "Oh my gosh, Kurt's the Deacons Quorum advisor, and I need to release him from that." And he said at the time that up to that point, he had never had such a direct voice from the Spirit come to him and say, "No, Kurt is where I want him to be and need him to be." And so he had spent that year just trying to understand more about what it means to be gay and had read a lot in preparation. He was preparing himself for the inevitable thing that he believed that I would come in and share that with him. And so that was my first experience with a priesthood leader. And there was something profound about that because I think in a lot of ways my bishop was representing the church and God to me at that moment. Like I needed to believe through a priesthood leader that I was acceptable, that I could be loved, and that God moved through him in a really powerful way for me to leave that meeting and say, I am acceptable, that God knows me and would do such a profound thing with a priesthood leader, just for me and to meet a very specific need I had at the time. It was during that period that there was really several important things that came out of this therapy and talking to my bishop. The first is that God's love and truth can be found in many places beside our faith. And in fact, God led me outside of our faith because our faith had very little to say at the time on how to flourish as a gay Christian. And that's really profound to me, Richard, because it shows me that sometimes, even in our faith, if we're not really willing to ask the right questions, if we're not being curious, there's really not much insight God can give us. And so what I found out is in these other faith traditions that they were asking the questions, and there was writers and people thinking about these issues, and God seemed to continually lead me to really impactful voices out there, which I wasn't able to find in our faith. And as I even attended some of these weekend retreats, he raised up some really wonderful friends that I have to this day that support me, and we seem to be able to walk together in this. But probably the most important realization, even though I was getting emotionally healthy in so many ways, is that I came to the understanding that my orientation did not budge. And there was something really freeing to me about that, because I knew that I was accepted by God. I'd had that experience with my bishop. I knew I was trying to live a good life. I knew I'd put, if it was possible to change, I would think that the effort that I put in toward that would have caused that. And so I felt at peace realizing that there wasn't change, and maybe God could change, but he seems to choose for his purposes not to change us. And that was really freeing to me and was very relieving for me to have that information. It was also during this time that I had this like just really profound dream. And in the dream, I was standing in front of the Savior, and in between us was a hologram image of myself, looking great, dressed, and, just this perfect image of facade of what I have tried to project to the world. Of course, me behind that hologram, I'm sort of shabby and, all the things I probably truly thought about myself. But the hologram image is the one that's speaking. So I have my Savior in front of me, this hologram image speaking, and me behind it. And he's praising Christ, and he's saying all sorts of this beautiful, flowery, eloquent things. And as the hologram is speaking, the Savior, I'm becoming aware, he's not responding at all, but he's becoming more and more agitated until he finally had enough. And he said to me, "I don't want him, I want you." And then he reaches through the hologram, which evaporated the moment he touched it, and pulled me into his arms. And this was a profound confirmation to me that God knew me as I was and loved me. And I also come to realize that God wanted all of me, the true me, and not the facade that showed up each week to church pretending to be straight in order to fit in. And I learned that God doesn't want his children to fit in. He wants them to belong to this wonderful body of Christ. And once I accepted that God loves all of me, he put me on this path, which I'm still walking today, of discovering that my wife, my children, my friends could love me, all of me as well. And this has given me the courage to this day, to come onto this podcast and open my mouth and share my story. And I think one of the problems of shame as a gay man or gay woman is that we believe that we really can't truly be loved. And the reason being is we put out these facades, and we know that maybe people, what we've created is being loved, but we really deep down know that's not really us. And so we have this disconnect, like if people really knew me, they couldn't love me. And I think that's one of the most important reasons of why we do come out. And again, it doesn't need to be to everybody. I've spent a lot of years coming out individually to different people, but just knowing that we can be seen and loved. It was also, I had some direction. Which came in sort of a different way to me. I was thinking about this movie. It's an old movie from the 1940s, Shirley Temple the Bluebird. And probably nobody has any idea who that is. But in this movie, there's this little girl, and she's just miserable and unhappy and sort of mean and discontent. And she has this fairy come to her and tells her, "Hey, if you go out on this journey and find this bluebird, you're going to be able to be happy." And so she, with her little brother and some companions, they go on this journey. And they first of all go in the past, and her grandparents who are dead, she tries to find the bluebird there. She can't. She goes and lives with this wealthy family and has everything wealth can give her, and she doesn't find it there. And then she had this just impression, I want to go home. And she eventually goes home, and there's this, she had at the beginning of the movie, she had found this like she thought was a blackbird, but when she looks up at the cage, she sees that it was actually a bluebird, and she's able to find the happiness. And so I felt directed at this period of my life to just emotionally come home and look for my support in my marriage, with my children, raising them in my ward, in my quorum. And I began to, for me, it was transformative to create more of this community. And instead of believing that happiness was out there somewhere, I began to put more of my efforts on of making my happiness and experiencing it within the things that God had already given me.
You know, there's a lot of things that just rush to my mind. I love you coming out to your bishop, and I think I meet with parents sometimes that wonder if they have an LGBTQ child, and I think generally they should stay close with Heavenly Father and act on their impressions. It may be appropriate at times, in probably the exception, to ask somebody if they're gay, but I think most of the time it needs to be the LGBTQ person to coming out, like your bishop did, and during that time use it as a time to learn and prepare and grow so that LGBTQ people around you can come out. And I love your bishop being close enough to the Spirit, Kurt, that he didn't release you from being a deacon's quorum instructor, and that instead God told him just the opposite, that he wanted you to be that deacon's quorum instructor. And I think that was for the deacons, because I bet you were really helping him, but I think it was partly for you, that God knew you were worthy and capable and a priesthood holder that could bless the lives of the people in your ward. And this hologram story, the whole podcast were just a hologram story. We could just say amen and go home. That is such a powerful story. And I apologize for our listeners if we're getting a little background as I'm talking. We're getting more of that than when Kurt's talking. But I just love what Christ wanted in you. He wanted all of you. And if you're an LGBTQ person listening, that's a powerful story for all of us. And so thank you for sharing that. What were some of the affirming conversations or moments you've had with those you love?
As I mentioned, so over the last, of not being completely out, but I did feel this impression that I needed to be seen. And so I began to just choose different men that I felt that I could love and trust. And there was something, I had this need because I had such a fear around my own masculinity that I think I had this need to be affirmed by men, that I knew. And so one of the first things I did is I was in the elders quorum at the time, and I went to my elders quorum president and I said, I want to home teach these specific men. And I said, use your inspiration, and I'm okay if it's not. But he came back and said, yeah, that's fine. So one of these men who is a dear friend to me his name's Mark. And I started home teaching his family, and I just, fell in love with them, and they fell in love with me, and we're still just, we love each other to this day. But I had this impression that I wanted to share with Mark that I was gay. It was important to me to be seen by other men in that way. And so I went to his house, and we went into his office, and we're talking, and I just said it, Mark, I wanted to share with you that I'm gay. And to me, even to this day, this is probably the most powerful response somebody has given me to this day. So Mark looks at me and he goes, Kurt, there are two things that I just have had a big problem with in my life. And he said, one of them is gay people and the other is fat people. And now here I am fat and my best friend is gay. and it's interesting because even to this day, he will say that me sharing that was transformative to him and wanting to care and love for people on the fringe. And he is such an example to me to this day of just, reaching out and loving on people that we would call more on the fringes in our ward. And so I thought that was a beautiful experience. And then just, recently, I have a younger friend who's actually a college professor, and he was very vulnerable with me and was sharing some of his challenges around faith. And I just was just a listening ear for him, and we would meet a lot and just talk about where he was at, and he was able to sort of move through a lot of those issues. And I think just having a listening ear and somebody that was non-judgmental, something I've learned because of my experience of being gay. And so we'd known each other for, a few years, and I had this impression that I wanted to share it with him. And so we met for breakfast, and I said, I wanted to share this with you, Ryan, that I'm, gay. That's part of my experience. And he said that when I had asked him out for dinner, that he had this impression that I was going to share that with him. And he, again, had not thought that before. And he goes, my next thought was, well, if Kurt doesn't share this with me, if Kurt doesn't share this with me, what kind of friend am I? And so I've had really good experience, but I felt that God has I wanted God to sort of lead me into those. And as I've taken the courage to follow those impressions, that they've turned out good. I've also had really beautiful experience sharing with my children. As I mentioned, my oldest daughter, Samantha, who lives actually in Salt Lake, we had an opportunity to go spend some time up further north where I grew up and spend some time with my sister. And I had not thought, I knew there would be a time when I wanted to share with my daughter that I was gay, but had not felt that impression up to that point. And we got up there late, and we went to bed, and I again had God teach me this beautiful thing in a dream. And in the dream, I'm sharing with Sam that I'm gay, your dad's gay. And in the dream, she comes back and she tells me how sad she would have been to have not known that about me, and perhaps have discovered it later, maybe after I'd passed away, that she was reading something, and that it would have been just heartbreaking for her. So anyway, I had that dream, and then the next day we were hanging out and just had some alone time together, and the dream came back to me, and I just thought, okay, God is directing me to share that this is the right timing. And so I shared it. And the most fascinating thing happened is after I shared with her that her dad was gay, that the words she spoke back to me were almost verbatim of what she had said and what I'd heard her say in the dream the night before. And so it was a real, again, testimony of God being willing to be in this driver's seat. And as I've shared over this last year of wanting to be more open, even with Mary and some of the challenges that we both feel around that, I've been able to see Mary being more open and sort of coming out in her own way with her friends. And she has 4 sisters that she's really close with. But she's begun to share that with her friends and family, people that she feels safe with. And I was deeply touched when she told me that after she shared with them that I was gay, that she deliberately stood back to observe. Now, and this is probably some of my own insecurities, I thought the next sentence she was going to say was that she wanted to observe how they would be treating her. But what she said was she stood back to observe that I wasn't treated differently by them, and how angry that would have made her if they had treated me differently. And that was that's who my wife is. I mean, she is this true and loving companion.
Thank you, Mary, if you're listening, and your kids, for walking this road as a family together and hopefully bringing you closer together as you navigate complicated stuff and have more honest, vulnerable conversations that often bring us together. That's I just appreciate you sharing that, because there's not a lot of stories I have on the podcast of the straight spouse sort of navigating that and how she or he shares with friends. But I love that story, Kurt. So if any of your family members are listening, I just put my arms around you as well as you, Kurt, and say you're doing a great job as a family. And it's not easy. We've all made mistakes, I'm sure, but I think you're doing a great job. What's your relationship with the church today, Kurt?
Well, my best friend recently sent me the following text, and I actually just copied it here and want to read it because I think it probably perfectly sums up where I am today. And so, quote, this is what he wrote. I've been listening to the song, It Is Well With My Soul, all morning and intermittently crying. I felt so touched by it and felt really impressed to share it with you. I think because of being gay, that we both internalize somewhere deep down inside that something is wrong with our souls, that something is fundamentally wrong with who we are. I love how the song beautifully affirms over and over again that everything is well with my soul. I'm beginning to believe that more and more. I love that the song also points me toward Christ. I think I can get lost in the weeds a little with the church sometimes, focusing on policies of things that annoy me, make me angry. I lose sight of why I love the gospel. I really do believe to my core that all my weaknesses and sins are nailed to the cross and died there because of Christ's sacrifice for me. I love the Savior of my soul. I know he sees me and loves me, unquote. I know that God has directed and continues to direct my path. And like my mission, it has been tough and beautiful. I believe if God loves and directs me, he will do that for all of his children. And so I think I'm more focused as I've got older on this vertical relationship that I have with God, and not so much on this horizontal. I love the gospel. I absolutely do. But I'm always going to what does God want me to do? Where is he directing me? And, I'm that's really where my focus is. I was up actually in Salt Lake, not too long ago at a singles ward that my daughter was attending, and she was actually the Relief Society president of that ward, and she was a little late. And I'm sort of looking around, and I'm looking at the, probably obviously gay chorister, and I'm looking at some of the kids that were sitting alone. They're, were a little awkward, and I'm looking at the guy who thought it was a good idea to come to church in a canary yellow suit. And I'm looking at, the cliques of the cool kids in the back. And I just often had this overwhelming, and maybe thinking about my own life, of just some sadness, well, how's life going to work out for these young men and women? And then I had this question given to me by the Spirit, very direct, actually two questions. And the first one was, Kurt, do you think that I'm big enough for them? And, I had to think about that for a while. But then the next question that gave me the clarity I needed, he said, Kurt, do you think that I've been big enough for you? And I started thinking about a lot of the things that I've already shared, and I have to come back just because of my experience and know that God has been big enough for me, and if he's been big enough for me, he would be big enough for them, regardless of where they were, and what they were experiencing, or what sadnesses or burdens or being gay or whatever that was facing them, and it was really a powerful experience to me. His gay children need direction on a church level. And in a lot of ways, it's going to come from this vertical relationship that they have with God, because there isn't a really clear path for us. There hasn't been a lot of light and knowledge that's been given for us. But I believe that is why the Spirit seems to be moving on you and many allies like you to provide space and support for us. If an LGBTQ plus friend came to me, and maybe I couldn't have said this a few years ago, Richard, but if they came to me and said, I feel God is directing me, for example, to step away from the church, because I believe in this powerful idea of free agency, and I've seen how God has directed me, then I have to trust that he will direct all his children as they seek it. And if they came to me and said that, then I would say, then leave. And if a friend said, I feel God directing me to date and marry someone of my own gender, then I would say, do it. I've had friends who have felt directed to do those things, who have felt that through seeking, through fasting and prayer and attending the temple. And why would I stand and say, oh, no, that couldn't be? Because I know the good and wonderful people they are and why they were seeking that. But I've also had friends who feel God calling them in just as powerful of ways to be celibate or to enter into celibate partnerships. And others feel God is calling them into mixed orientation marriages like he has me. And to them, I would also say, do it. If that is where God is calling you, he will support you and he will open up those effectual doors. And I know people who flourish in all these different paths. And I had a friend who was saying, well, how could you say that? Where's the scriptural example that would say we could say that? And I said, well, there's several, but one that comes to my mind is Nephi, who runs across Laban, who's drunk and passed out, and the Spirit comes to him and says, slay him. And here's Nephi, who his doctrine, what God had taught him and what he'd been taught his whole life is, thou shalt not kill. And here's this helpless man and the Spirit directing him to do something that was contrary to what he thought the doctrine was. And that he's told, slay him. And then he's given the reason, that it's better that one man perish than the whole nation perish in unbelief. And I believe that God looks at his children in their own individual lives, and he does not want them to perish. I wrote, I copied this down too, and I wrote the following to a friend recently who has felt God directing him into a same-sex marriage. And this is sort of my thoughts in a little paragraph I wrote him. And I just said, quote, I believe more and more in the gift of agency and choice God has given his children. I see him directing his gay children in so many radical ways, some into mixed orientation marriages, others into celibacy, and many into same-sex marriages. I am comforted in the knowledge that God knows each one of us individually, and if we seek his guidance, he will direct our paths for good. I know God has placed me in a mixed orientation marriage because he knows it would be the best environment for me to flourish and return to him. I am grateful to have my gay brothers and sisters in Christ. Of course, regardless of our choices, we will continue to be maligned and judged by some, but let's be comforted in following the path Christ has for us and let the consequences follow, unquote. And that's my thoughts, sort of where I'm at today.
I'm really comfortable with what you shared there, and I've learned, I just love the doctrine of personal revelation. I love the doctrine of agency, and I love the doctrine of the scope of our plan of salvation and a loving Heavenly Father. So when someone leaves our faith or someone chooses a path outside of our faith, I just leave that with God. I don't, and I just leave that with God. And I honor and I love what you're teaching here, to stay close with God and seek personal revelation with God. I've heard Tom Christofferson in a church setting talk about what would you counsel to dating same gender partners, and he'd say, I'd counsel them to sit down, pray together, hold hands, and ask God what they should do. And so I think that's just what you're teaching here. And then we leave it at the Savior's feet. So this is a complicated space. And so I love your voice as the LGBTQ person that's wrestled with this for decades, now giving thoughtful counsel to other people. I just think you know the space, you know God. He's clearly in your life. And so I trust your voice to help other LGBTQ people. And I do realize that there's not a lot of light and knowledge yet on this subject. And I just think more chapters will be written by our church leaders as they continue to wrestle with this. And I think that's fine. What are your hopes in regard for the church, Kurt, and its LGBTQ members?
Well, I have a lot of hope for the church, and I have a lot of hope for the members of the church providing space for us. And every experience that I've had where I felt, taken the leap of faith and shared with very specific people, I have always come away from it feeling loved, feeling accepted. And I have had this recurring dream for the last several years. And in the dream, there is a feast going on. So it would be like the feast of the body of Christ, the firstborn. But in the feast, they're feasting, and in the recurring dream, I'm always on the ground, just trying to pick up crumbs, And so through this dream, I've always been focused on me, and I feel this deprivation, this starvation, this not being seen. But it was a couple weeks ago, I had this dream again, and it was interesting that God came into the dream and asked me to, for the first time, he says, I want you to focus on those that are feasting on the table above you. I want you to look at them and not at you. And then he began to ask me some questions. And the first question he asked me is, why haven't they made space for you at the feast? Was the first question he asked. And then the next question he asked, why are you invisible to them? And then without me even answering that in the dream, he tells me why. He said, the reason is they don't know you're there. And then he directed me, he said, you need to open your mouth. And I think, as I think about the members, there's this thought that from that dream, that as we as LGBTQ plus members begin to open our mouth and say, we're here, we love God, we love this gospel, we want to be a part of this, I believe, and I have this hope, that the members of that feast will shift their chairs over and they will say, then come and feast with us. Now we know who you are, and now we know you are there, and we do not want you on the floor trying to find substance in the crumbs that maybe up to this point is all that you've had to eat.
Well, that put tears in my eyes again. Shift your chairs and welcome to the table. There's so much powerful imagery of that concept, a feast at the table. The crumbs are LGBTQ members, perhaps even really good people at the table that want to do the right thing, but haven't known LGBTQ people are there. And then as you open your voice like you're bravely doing in others, well-meaning people at the table shift their chairs and welcome you. That's really powerful, Kurt. And It's a lot. It kind of goes to the question when I meet someone that's been in the closet, so to speak, for decades. It's sort of what's the upside of coming out of the closet? It complicates potentially your relationship with your ward, with your spouse, with your children. So there's a lot of downsides to coming out, and I think it's fine if you don't feel anybody listening to this podcast that isn't your path to come out. I think Kurt and I would say that's fine. But I do think that many more are coming out, and it's just part of God's plan. It's time at that table, so to speak, that you're describing for the seats to turn. We're at a point in society's maturity that we can turn our chairs, and we want to turn our chairs, and it's just part of the gospel of Jesus Christ progressing. How can the church members better support their LGBTQ members?
Well, as I shared my story, I think every story, when you share, there has to be a call to action. And so my call to action to the members is that I pray that the wards that have LGBTQ plus individuals in their midst is that they will become family, especially for these ones that have filled that their calling is to remain celibate. Then we need to step up. The wards need to step up and expand their definition of what it means to be a family. And I think that's what really the proclamation is saying when it said the calamities will come. If we don't honor these families, I think we need to read that in a much larger context, that this idea of family for God isn't just about this little cute nuclear family, with big walls around it. I think what he's saying is it's this body, this family of Christ. So my challenge, my call to action is when you know that you have an LGBTQ plus member, is that you open up your life, you open up your home, your family to these truly exceptional sons and daughters of God, that you take that role of becoming our fathers and our mothers, our brothers and our sisters, our sons and daughters in every sense of the word. Bring us into your lives and into your homes. Make us family. And I don't think he's no longer content to have us remain his LGBTQ plus children, to remain on the fringes and in the shadows. Because the shadows are no place a son or daughter of God is meant to be or can really flourish in. And there was a lot of years in my life that I stood in those shadow places and I didn't flourish. I didn't expand. I wasn't meeting the measure of my creation. And we, like all God's children, that we are not exempt as his gay children, but we're also commanded to place our unique lights on the top of the hills. And we bring so many beautiful talents and sensitivities and creativity to this body of Christ that needs to be embraced and will cause this body of Christ to expand in so many beautiful ways that I don't think it could otherwise. And it's also my call to action is we want you not to reach down to us, but to reach across to us, that we are in full fellowship. We are equal with you in every sense of the word. And I know that because God treats me as an equal son or daughter. And so I believe that as members of the church do that, as they begin to see the unique talents of these wonderful members and embrace them and encourage them, that there is going to be this beautiful spice and flavor that will be brought into our wards in such a way. And we're also a group of people that completely understands the need to minister to the one and minister to the fringes because we've spent so much time there ourselves. And there's so much to learn from that. I think we need, and I would say that we need more than just passive allies. And what I mean by that is if a gay member comes to you and shares a story, they need more than you to say, oh, we love you, and, great. And that doesn't really change anything, but then that's it. It's never talked about again. We need active allies that are going to step toward us when we have the courage to stand up and say, hey, I'm here. Maybe you didn't know I was here, but I'm here. And that they do more than just be passive about it. I think we need active allies and being willing to listen to us. Most of us have so much to say because we haven't been able to speak for so much of our lives, and being willing to pull that out of us. I want to hear more of your story, and to do it until we're done talking. And, if you have something you wanted to say, like in my life for 58, 59 years, I have a lot to say, and I've had a lot of thoughts to say, and hopefully you can be patient with me. One of the worst things, and I've heard this, is a gay member coming and wanting to dialogue with some of their leaders. And at some point, the leaders, and this has happened, recently I heard this, the leader saying, oh, I think you're being obsessive, over this. And your identity should be in Christ. And why are you putting it in this? And it's like, please don't shut down the conversation by saying those type of things. Let us speak, let us choose the identity that we seek at this time. Even our church says, which I think is beautiful and is ahead of a lot of the religions, they say, however somebody wants to identify themselves, honor that. And if you're not clear of why that is, ask them what that means. When that person used lesbian or gay, tell me what that means. Don't make an assumption that just because I say I'm gay, it means I'm living a sinful life. Ask me what that means. Just a real quick example about being an active ally and why that's powerful. There's a stake that's an adjoining stake to us that's doing a family home evening now that their stake president has called, some people to organize for LGBTQ plus members. And my wife and I attended the first time that they met a few months ago, and it had a lot of gay members, but also allies. And it was interesting for me, Richard. It was the first time I think I've been in a room with allies. Wow. A lot of my work has been just all of gay, maybe it's a room of just sort of gay members trying to fellowship and strengthen each other. But there was something so beautiful that the allies were able to contain a very powerful boundary in a sacred space for us. And their whole desire there was to bless, to strengthen, and to be there for us. And there was something so leveling, I think, for me by that experience. And so be an ally. This stake also is doing these ally nights where they're inviting members just to come in and have questions, and some of us will go there and just casually, answer whatever questions they have. And, some of them, they ask these questions and you're like, wow, you're thinking that, but in just a very gentle, loving, patient way, we're willing to say, well, maybe you should think about it this way, or this is how we think about it. And so those are just some of my thoughts about how we can support.
I'm just so touched by so much of that, and just the journey you've been on, and that you've never been to around a group of allies, and how helpful that is, and just to start to see community being created in a stake here and there. It would be consistent with our doctrine to create an FHE night for allies. That's not necessarily in the handbook, but creating tools to minister to our members and bear their burdens and help them is part of our doctrine. So I love what that stake is doing, and I'm aware of some of the people that are attending that ally night, and I admire LGBTQ people and their patience to educate those of us that are new to the space. And that takes sometimes a bit of patience, and I love what you taught about. One of the best things we can do as allies is listen and listen and listen, and not turn the conversation to our gay relative or our gay experience or experience with a gay person. And sort of sometimes when someone says they have cancer, not to compare being gay with cancer, please don't take it that way, anybody. But then we sort of shift the conversation when someone opens up about their own cancer diagnosis to all the people we know with cancer, versus what we really need to do is stay focused on that person as they're bravely opening up about a difficult situation. And that's what you're teaching us here, Kurt, is to listen and keep listening. So we're going to kind of conclude this podcast. Tell our listeners, if, some may think there's no gay people in my ward. What would you say to somebody who says there's no gay people in my ward? And statistically, how many gay people are sitting there in each ward that are active members of our ward that are just closeted?
One really thing we do as LDS is we just keep having gay children. We're very good at that. Statistically, every ward probably has somewhere between 4 and 5 gay members. And it's interesting, even though I'm not really out, is I've been telling certain members lately, if it pertains, I'll say, well, we have gay members in this ward. And which we do. I mean, there is one other couple in my ward that's in a mixed orientation marriage that I know of. And so they're there. And I think it's important to realize that they're in our midst. And I guess maybe the sad part for me is, well, why, if they're in our midst, why don't we know? And maybe that shows the sort of work we need to do in our wards and the church to what will allow them to feel like they can be, come up from underneath the table and just say, here I am, and wanting to be loved and wanting to be included. And so they're there. And if they're not there, it means that they have left, and which is also really sad for me, because I think our church, we can flourish. We can have a wonderful experience if our fellow members make a space for us at the feast.
What would you say in closing? I have 2 questions for you. What would you say, and this may have been answered as you've shared so much, what would you say for parents of an LGBTQ child? And then the next question is, what would you say to our younger LGBTQ members?
Well, the first thing I would say to the parent is that I think the stance that God really wants for you as a parent is just to be curious. And there's something really wonderful about that. So if you have a gay child come to you and tell you that, I think the worst thing you can do is, well, let me tell you what the doctrine is. Because that child is very aware of what the doctrine is. But if you come to them and say, well, tell me what this means. Tell me what you're experiencing. Tell me where you feel you're being led. And I think by being curious with your gay children, what that's going to happen is they're going to feel safe and they're going to draw closer to you. And perhaps what influence that you could have will happen because they're going to trust you and they know that you're interested and you're not judging them. And so I would just say be curious about their experience and be willing to talk. I mean, recently, I'm now the priest quorum advisor, and our stake president, I'd had a bunch of dialogues with him about perhaps doing a Fifth Sunday or fireside, and his first comment was, well, this affects so few people. in our stake. He said, I know maybe, 3 or 4. Maybe I can suspect a few others. And he goes, I really feel my responsibility if I'm going to do something that will have, the most bang for his buck and affect the most people. And I said, hey, President, could I push back a little bit on that? And he said, sure. And I said, well, typically each ward is going to have, 4 to 5 statistically gay members. But I said, above that, I said, how many in each ward have gay siblings, gay children, gay friends that they love? I said, you're starting to see quite a few. And then I said, and then just the final point, I said, the millennials, the recent studies they've been doing on them, that one of the top reasons that they are leaving the church is around LGBTQ plus reasons. And I said, you start looking at all those demographics, and then you're starting to see that this is not an outlier issue. And he, because of the good man he is, later texted me and just said, you know what, that has been so transformative to me, where I thought it really didn't affect hardly anybody. Now I'm thinking, well, who doesn't it affect? And he was actually willing just recently to give a talk in state conference on loving those on the fringe. And the main example he brought up was LGBTQ plus members. And one thing he did is he asked the congregation, he said, I'd like everybody to raise their hand who knows somebody and loves somebody who is LGBTQ plus in their life. And it was powerful to look around and see pretty much 100% of that congregation raise their hand. And so it gave me, I think there's something powerful in that when we get our leaders speaking about it, because it gives permission on a ward level to also talk about it. So I took that advantage. And so a few weeks ago in priest quorum, I have my brand new bishop, first time he'd attended, sitting next to me. And I just said, hey, I want to talk about our stake president's talk. And I said, I want to ask you, how many of you know somebody who's LGBTQ plus? 100%, of course, these, young man, maybe 15, 16 of them. And then I looked at the bishop and I said, hey, Bishop, if one of these young men came to you and told you that they were gay, what would you say? And he gave, this beautiful answer, but the most important thing I was trying to share to these young men, maybe this sort of answered your second question, is that it's a safe place, that they are good men to seek help and to counsel. And the other advice I would give these young men and women, these gay members, these teenagers, is that just develop your relationship to God, develop your relationship with Christ, and let them direct you, wherever that leads, let them guide you. And as my own life, and hopefully the story that I've shared as I've, way down the road, is that God will direct you if you seek it. And wherever I have followed that path, wherever I have felt that inspiration and done it, only good things have come into my life. And I've also been pleasantly surprised that when I've opened up, when I shared with my first bishop, when I've shared with friends, that even though there's this part of me that's thinking, oh, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be ostracized, that none of that has occurred in my life. I have only been embraced and loved. And I also need my LGBT plus Q friends, because there is still some challenges, but there's also a unique fellowship there. And I think that's the really necessary part of our experience of having those in our lives that think and understand completely in a way that maybe a straight ally couldn't even understand of what our experiences is, and seek them out seek out good people to mentor you. And I think maybe in some ways that's maybe what God's calling me is. I think he needs older members who have been down the road to say, hey, it can be done. With God's help, nothing is impossible. And even navigating what it means to be gay and Christian, that there can be a path, and it can be very unique. And I won't judge what that path is. And I see God, and I do believe God directing his children in a lot of different ways as gay children. But there should be peace for that, for whatever that young gay teenager is, to realize that God will direct me. And if I follow that I will have joy in my life, and that I will be able to return back to him.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm so touched by your closing answer. I'm in your stake conference right now, and what you've done by just engaging your stake president and in a kind moment, and him being humble enough to be teachable, and then leading to the talk he gave. But I love the vocabulary you said he used, where he talked about if you have an LGBTQ person in your, and he said positive things from what you said, but I'm thinking about all those hands going up. And then if I'm a closeted LGBTQ person in your stake, I'm 16, 17, 18 or older, and I'm seeing all those hands go up, and the impact that would make on me and how I feel. And that these people, it's very symbolic to me to have those hands go up. And if I'm a closeted LGBTQ person, I just wonder about the burdens that were lifted that day, and a little more hope given, or that people have family that are LGBTQ, that we never talk about that subject at church. Just felt like, progress was made. So if local leaders are listening to this podcast, that's, a really powerful example of what can be done with the thoughtful impression. And I wish everybody in the church could listen to this podcast, Kurt. I feel like I've been in a training meeting that I was probably craving for before my YSA assignment, to understand better how to minister to all the people I have priesthood responsibility. And my journey, of course, is it's the first time as a singles word bishop I sat down and listened to a gay man. And I realized I had priesthood responsibility to do the right thing for this brother, and priesthood responsibility for the closeted people in my ward. I had a strong impression there were, and what was I going to do to give them hope and heal them and point them, like you're talking about, to Christ. So any concluding thoughts before we sign off, Kurt?
I just want to thank you, Richard, for providing space. If you had not taken up your call in your personal ministry and followed the Spirit, then this conversation wouldn't be happening. And you're an example to me of somebody who is following God in a very unusual, somewhat radical way. And I think that is really, if each one of us really goes to God and say, what do you want? What is my purpose in this life? I think he will direct us in very radical ways. And I think when we do that, we do find out in such a unique way that we can touch and influence so many people in our lives. And that's actually a line in my patriarchal blessing, that I will touch and influence the lives of many people. And as a closeted, in the shadows member, that was never going to happen. And it's interesting that God has looked to the place of my deepest shame and pulled out of that my experience of coming to know him from that place, and also directing me to open my mouth and to minister and to bless others. And then I think, well, isn't that what it means in the end of taking up our cross and following him? I think it's usually going to come out of our place of deepest shame as we let God come in and make something something beautiful of that place that we have hidden, tried to hide away so much in our lives. And that when he does that, we truly, for me at least, I come to understand how Christ said he would descend below all things, my things, and that he could make of those places, those swampy places of my life, those dark places, and by bringing light to them, make something beautiful. It sort of reminds me of Nauvoo, just some horrible swamp. But when the saints came in and drained it, they created out of that a beautiful city. And I think if we give ourselves over to God, that he can take those places of sorrow and shame and fear, and by draining those, he can create something really beautiful from those.
Wow. Well, thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Mary, if you're listening, Kurt's wife, your 3 wonderful children, and thank you for teaching us about the gospel of Jesus Christ today, Kirk, and your life as a gay Latter-day Saint. And on behalf of all the listeners, I think 5,000 to 10,000 people listen to each episode now, and that's because of people like you that bravely step forward and want to share your stories. On behalf of all of our listeners, we love you, brother. We are grateful for who you are and your journey and sharing that with us, and the things that you're doing now to help more people join in that feast. And thank our listeners for joining us on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler.